This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome back, everyone, to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. I'm your host, Tony Black, and I'm joined by one of our most seasoned veteran guests for a sequel episode to what is officially the greatest X-Files episode ever. Fact. Pusher.
Right, we can wrap up. We can go home, people. We've done our job here.
Yeah.
It's
All done. With me is Darren Mooney. Hello, Darren.
Hi, Tony. How are things?
I'm great because I'm talking about Kitsunegari with you, the sequel to Pusher, the greatest X-Files episode ever, which is one we've had in the pipeline. We did Pusher, I think it was just over a year ago we recorded Pusher, and then it came out some time ago now when we're doing season 3. Well, I say just over a year ago in terms of when we're recording. You're going to be listening to this quite a way ahead of when we're recording this, so Pusher will be even older for you.
So let's make lots of topical references.
Well, you know, since the general election in the UK, when the ghost of Margaret Thatcher inhabited Nigel Farage and took control of the country, that was a shocker, Darren, wasn't it, really?
I would say that I was a bit surprised, but I wasn't really. It somehow seemed right.
Oh, we're already getting too political for the X-Cast, don't worry. But yeah, it's nice to come back for Kitsunegari, Darren. I think we had to follow up Pusher, didn't we, and come back and do the sequel, even though it is a little bit of diminishing returns.
I mean, you know, come on. If we're going to do an episode covering a disappointing sequel, Tony, I think we should go all in and make this a disappointing sequel. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm pitching right here, right now. Not to lay my cards too heavily on the table before we begin.
What score is Darren going to give Kitsunegari, I wonder? So yeah, Kitsunegari is the 8th episode of season 5. It first aired on January the 4th, 1998, so it was the first episode back that year after the Christmas sort of hiatus. It was written by Vince Gilligan and Tim Minear and directed by Daniel Sackheim. So obviously this episode sees the return of Robert Patrick Modell, aka Pusher, the season 3 villain who tormented Mulder and Scully and who has the ability to push his will onto others. And when he escapes from his maximum security facility, he starts his dastardly deeds again. But things are not quite what they seem this time around. So, we've sort of hinted at this already, Darren. Out of 10, what would you give Kitsunegari?
This is a tough one, because I actually, despite my jokes, have a bit of a soft spot for Kitsunegari. And this is one of those things where I like the episode for reasons that I'm not entirely sure are intentional. In that I kind of... I have friends who joke that, you know, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but should be my middle name. So Darren, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but Mooney gives this like a 6.5 or maybe even a 7 at a push, because there's a lot in this episode that I like, even if it doesn't quite work. And the reason why it doesn't quite work is kind of why I like it, not to get ahead of ourselves.
Hey, I'd go for a 7. Absolutely.
Ooh, okay,
cool. Yeah, I'm with you, definitely. I mean, I genuinely think it's a little bit underrated, actually. I think it's always held up sort of alongside Pusher, which is this classic piece of not just the X-Files, but like American 90s television. And it's never going to compete, you know? It's Return of the Jedi up against The Empire Strikes Back. You know, it's not going to compete. But I think it's fairly fast paced. It's got quite a few interesting twists to it. It's got some great music by Mark Snow. One of my favourite scores to any episode Mark Snow's ever done. This one. It's got Skinner in there. It's got
I think you mean Mel Cooley.
Mel Cooley. Oh, it's Mel Cooley. You know, it's got elements of the Pusher formula, and to its credit, even though it doesn't quite work, and I give you that, it tries to do something different. It doesn't try and give you Pusher 2 in exactly the same way, and I think for that reason even above all the rest, I think it deserves a bit more of a pat on the back than it gets.
Which is interesting, because I sense you and I are going to be coming at this episode from very almost diametrically opposed angles. Because part of what I actually really like about Kitsunegari is that it feels very playful, and I agree with you on that. But I think part of that playfulness is down to the fact that it is, again, this is the... I might be reading too much into it, but it very much feels like the episode is kind of taking a bit of a tilt at the whole concept of doing a cynical, cash-in, bring back the monster sequel episode. In that it seems almost like self-aware and like consciously goofing on it and riffing on it and kind of almost like parodying the idea of, well, we had this really popular episode 2 seasons ago, guess we're doing it again! And kind of like, and like, I mean, we'll talk about specifics of it later on, but it's very telling that like all the actual characters in the episode, with the one notable exception, are like, really? We're doing this again? But the episode is structured in such a way that it's like, yeah, you're doing this again. And I actually really like that sort of dichotomy and push and pull that exists within it. So yeah, I kind of like, that's my soft spot for it, I think.
Yeah, I can see that, if I'm honest. It does have a certain awareness of its place as a sequel, I suppose. Because, you know, the X-Files didn't really do many of these, did it? I mean, I think we are going to do an episode eventually on sort of sequel episodes in the X-Files, you know, sort of a standalone supplemental podcast talking about this. But, you know, they're fairly few and far between, I would say. Actual direct sequels that aren't mythology, you know, that are just sequels to Monster of the Week or random one-off episodes. You know, so, and most of the big monsters tend to get one. You know, Donny Faster gets one later, and Toombs had got one in the same season, so that was, you know... But, I mean, it's one of those things, and I think we talked about this when we talked about Pusher. You know, I mean, I think realistically, if the X-Files was ever rebooted, a character like Pusher would be a season-long villain in like a proper serialized sort of arc. You know, he's a big potential character for any kind of reboot, as would be Toombs, essentially, as would people like Donny Faster. All these sort of villains would be pumped up, I guess. So it kind of makes sense in some respects that they would get a sequel. But what do you think, while we're on this subject, where do you think it sort of stands in terms of some of the bigger sequel episodes for the monsters in the X-Files? You know, does it compare with like your Toombs and your Orison, you know, and those kind of things?
Well, it's a very different kind of challenge that it's kind of doing, because, like, if you look at the episodes in question, you look at things like, for example, Toombs exists largely because, I think, as I recall, Glenn Morgan and James Wong weren't happy with the direction on Squeeze, and so wanted a kind of another go-round on that, and they managed to get very, very lucky, because Toombs is absolutely amazing. I know you and I both like Squeeze a lot, but they were much more impressed with how Toombs turned out. And that was happening within the space of a single season as well, so you had the character appearing at the start and the end of the season, almost providing a bit of a bookend, which was very clever as well, and it worked rather structurally. I'm not a huge fan of Orison, and there are lots of different reasons for that. I think I covered this on when we did the pod watch, kind of what my issues with Orison are and stuff like that. I don't think it really works as a sequel, because it's very much, it's Donny Faster bolted on to a different story, and if I'm being honest, I suspect the different story is the one that Chip Johannesson, the writer, wanted to tell, because that's all like, tray panning, time slowing down, space, time, dimensions, awareness, which has this sort of like very third season sort of Bardo Thadol sort of millennium kind of mood to it. And it's like, you can tell that at some point somebody in the X-Files office was like, look, fine, you can do it, but we're going to have to like bolt on this kind of serial killer from, you know, the second season onto it. And it doesn't work in that respect either. So I kind of put this almost between those two extremes, because interestingly enough, how this was developed, Menier, the writer who only worked on the 5th season of the X-Files, he's got very few credits on the X-Files. I think his other big one is Mind's Eye, which I think is chronically underrated as an episode. It's absolutely fantastic, not just because of its guest performance from Lily Taylor, but even things like he'd go on to do Angel and sort of prove himself there. He'd work with Joss Whedon. And he had originally envisaged this as a standalone episode, which ironically enough, given we were just riffing on Orison for like bolting a previous monster onto a standalone story idea, he originally envisioned an idea for this, which is very similar to what Orison would be in the 7th season, which is this idea of a man in prison hearing the voice of God and suddenly finding himself freed from prison and given a divine purpose to follow. Which, if you've if you are watching this in sequence, forget that I said any of that, because it's not at all a spoiler for what's coming in the 7th season. But which, if you have seen the 7th season, is very similar to what the show does with Donny Faster. And it's because the 5th season was under a production crunch. And I mean, you probably have talked about this in the episodes around it. And I mean, even if you haven't, you know that there's a gigantic movie that was filmed between seasons and everybody was really exhausted and really tired. The script wasn't coming along, so I think it was Frank Spotnitz came up with the idea of, like, just cram Robert Patrick Modell in there and hope for the best. Maynard teams up with Gilligan. Gilligan sits down and they sort of hammer out the script together. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that it began as a very different idea, this episode can't but work as a sequel. Unlike Orison, where Faster feels superfluous to the story that's being told to a certain extent, where you can imagine the X-File existing without, like, adding Faster to it. In fact, Faster feels like he's an ingredient too many. This doesn't work unless you've got Modell in there, but also at the same time it doesn't have the purity of Toombs, where Toombs only exists because, you know, Eugene Victor Toombs is such an interesting character and concept, which puts it in a strange place and sort of between the two. I kind of like that there are so few sequels. I like the X-Files was a different monster every week. And, you know, despite the fact that we love the serialization of the show and the mythology and even the character development as it sort of unfolds across the run of the series, I know that, like, you and I have complained and other guests have complained, and it's a legitimate observation that sometimes characterization isn't entirely consistent from episode to episode because you're still in the 90s and you're still doing episodic television where you've still got different writers approaching the show with different voices and kind of with different purpose. I like that those episodes tend to be so distinct and you don't have too many sequel episodes. And I kind of, like, I feel like Kitsunegari just about gets away with it because it's really the only episode between those two extremes, if that makes sense. And I kind of like it in large part because watching Kitsunegari, and again, I may be reading too much into it, but you really get a sense of the writing staff sitting down. I don't know whether they knew it before they sat down to write it, or whether it kind of just came to Gilligan and Minear as they were writing it. But you get a real sense of, sequel episodes maybe aren't a good idea. And I kind of like that the episode sort of works that out through itself to a certain extent.
I find it interesting how it wasn't all Vince Gilligan. You know, Vince Gilligan obviously was Pusher's a big, you know, inspiration for Breaking Bad. And when we talked about Pusher in that episode, I hadn't seen Breaking Bad at that point. And all this points you were making about that. And now I have. Now I've seen Breaking Bad and I can appreciate all that stuff. You know, I can, you know, Pusher was not just a great Vince Gilligan script, but it was a very, very Vince Gilligan idea, essentially, what he was doing. So this, you know, this obviously, based on what you've just said as well, feels more like Tim Minear bringing in his ideas and trying to brew them up after, you know, Frank Spotnitz says, you know, throw Modell in there and then getting the original Pusher writer in to sort of work with him on it. So, you know, Tim Minear's bringing a lot of his own ideas to this, and they don't know this yet, but he will become a fairly big get, you know, because he's like, he will go on to work on Angel quite heavily and Firefly and quite a lot of the Joss Whedon shows, and then beyond that, things like American Horror Story quite significantly as well. So and previously I think he'd done Lois and Clark before this. So, you know, he's an interesting writer. Obviously, as you say, didn't do a lot. So it feels almost like he's bringing those ideas into the pot, and it's a bit of a, you know, a hydra of a beast in terms of who writes it. It doesn't have that you know, very auteur feeling. Yeah, that Pusher did. And in that sense, I think, it is created for sequel's sake. You know, Spotnitz coming in and go, oh, this is a great chance to get Pusher back in because he was popular. And the reality is, I mean, you know, the way Pusher ends, it's pretty definitive. You know, it's not like he's in a cell going, I'll get you, Mulder, you know, like at the end of like an old Batman episode or something. He's got a bullet in the head, he's dying slowly, and they're very much a case of, right, let's forget this man ever existed, see you later. So to bring him back 2 years later, it is a bit cynical.
That said, though, and again, I don't know who is responsible for how much of what part of the script, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is a sense of Gilligan who could be Gilligan has this kind of very folksy, very charming kind of persona that he gives in interviews. Like, he's a wonderful interviewee subject. He's absolutely fantastic. He's talking about stuff. But Gilligan also has a very, like, biting, dark sense of humor. I mean, Gilligan's the guy who said, I'm not sure if I believe there's a heaven, but I absolutely have to believe there's a hell, is apparently his own personal theology. So he's got a little bit of an edge to him, as some of the writing and some of his writing suggests. And part of me wonders if there aren't elements of this that are very much like Gilligan saying, okay, you want a sequel to Pusher? I will give you a sequel to Pusher. Where it's like, it's gonna be like, and again, we haven't really talked about the episode yet, but you can see looking at it that it's playing with certain tropes of sequels. Like, it's not quite like Bride of Pusher, but it's like little sister of Pusher, basically. And like the whole thing, that the way that he structures it is very much built around this assumption that how bad horror sequels work, and he's going to give you one.
Yeah, he's going to cobble all these things together from different angles and throw it at you. Yeah, I know. And maybe that is part of the charm, I guess. Also back as well, as apart from someone like Vince Gilligan, he's Daniel Sackheim as director. And he's somebody who he was a producer across the X-Files, but he hadn't directed anything since The Host, actually, at the start of season 2. And he did Deep Throat and Conduit. So he's quite a formative presence in the creation of the X-Files. And, more from a production standpoint. But it's... It was interesting to have him back on, because I think he's, all those episodes I've just cited, I find them to be pretty great in terms of how they look, how they visually come across. I think Sackheim, had he gone on to direct more episodes of the show, I think he would have ended up venerated a little bit more like a Rob Bowman, maybe.
And that's it exactly. I mean, look, if you look at Sackheim's work after the X-Files, and in particular, like somebody pointed out that, like, he worked on, say, Game of Thrones, which is obviously a big one. And I mean, David Nutter also worked on Game of Thrones, if we're drawing sort of X-Files connections there as well. But even things like, he had a phenomenal, I think, 24 Hours in American television, where he directed, I think it was like was it the second or third season sort of finale or penultimate episode of Better Call Saul, and a really great episode of The Leftovers as well, in the space of 24 hours on American television, which is like pretty much as good as you can hope to sort of get as an American TV director. And Sackheim is really, really great. I think, though, that it's very clear that this episode kind of suffers a little bit from the fact that Sackheim is not Bowman, because Bowman has and again, sorry, this is very taken, has a very particular set of skills. Because, I mean, I denigrated Orison sort of earlier in the podcast. It's ironic that Orison is a Bowman episode. In fact, I think it may be his last episode, or his second penultimate episode. I don't know whether Enemy comes earlier or later. But the part of the problem with Orison for me is that it's not suited towards Bowman's directorial style, because it's a serial killer episode, and Bowman is a very good action kinetic thriller director, and you can tell when you're watching Orison that Bowman is like, yeah, this Hitchcock stuff is a little creepy, isn't it? All this, like, voyeuristic leering at women and sort of peering at them from weird angles. It's kind of intrusive and a little uncomfortable. I'm not sure I'm entirely comfortable doing that. As opposed to, say, Kim Manners or David Nutter, who are much more comfortable in that sort of, like, Hitchcock-style, Kubrick-style mold. Bowman tends to be more go, 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 frantic, frantic, frantic. And it's telling that, like, some of Bowman's best contributions with Gilligan are, like, literally built around this idea of kinetic movement. Pusher is the most obvious example, but even Drive in the 6th season, where it's all go, go, go. And I think that Kitsunegari suffers maybe a little bit from the fact that Sackheim isn't as kind of kinetic or frantic a director, that his editing isn't as tight and his cameras isn't as propulsive, and he doesn't build momentum in the same way that kind of Bowman does as a storyteller. Sackheim's very good. This is a very nice looking episode of television. It's full of great images. I mean, that great shot of the character who's covered in blue paint is one of the most striking things in the 5th season of The X-Files, which is one of the best seasons of the show. But it doesn't have that, it doesn't hold together, and it doesn't kind of have that propulsive quality that I think, that Pusher had. And part of that's probably down to the script, but I also wonder if maybe part of this is down to Bowman as well, or down to lack of Bowman as well. I mean,
it could be.
It's telling that, like, one of the guest characters, actually Bowman, is actually named in honor of the director as well.
That's true, Linda Bowman. And I think you're right when you say it's partly about the script, because I think the nature of this story is different. In obviously with Pusher, it's as much a chase thriller as catching the bad guy, Mulder Sherlock pusher Moriarty kind of thing, whereas this is a mystery essentially. It's a bad mystery, and it's a mystery that is that isn't really particularly difficult, you know.
But is it intentionally a bad mystery, Tony? Is the question?
Well, this is it. That's the big question, right? But so I think that by the very dynamic of it, it doesn't have that. It can't have that propulsion in the same way as Push It, because it isn't constructed in that kind of way as a story. And that's, on the one hand, commendable. Like I said earlier, how the fact it doesn't try and just redo the same thing. But on the other, it makes for it doesn't utilise that character, and it doesn't have that. Sackheim can't get to that in the same way. You know, whether he would have done anyway if he'd had Pusher 2, you know, and it was a very similar Modell escapes, takes Mulder on a, you know, crazy journey of murder in his hospital gown. It might not have been the same, you know. But then maybe it would have, because before you really get the death of Nathan Bowman, it almost feels like it is going that way, because it is Modell out there. They are hunting him. There is the phone call of "it's alive," you know, that kind of thing. And that's at first. That first like 10 minutes does feel like it's Pusher 2, and then it takes that left turn, and then it becomes something else. So anyway, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves. We'll talk more about this in the main bit. But before we do,
not in the main bit yet?
No, not yet. No, we got to. I know we've got to do the IMDb score. So obviously this is our regular feature. We see what it got on IMDb. What do you think, Darren? What's your guess about what it may have? I'm guessing you don't know the Kitsunegari score on IMDb.
No, I've not memorized the entire X-Files TV show IMDb. I realize I host a podcast on the IMDb, but I am not the IMDb. But here's so. It's definitely going to be higher than your score and my score, because we're 6.5 and you're 7. And I know that, like, even when you get to like the 9th season, you're lucky to scrape that with the passable episodes. I also know that, like, we're at the peak of the show. It's very popular, and you've got lots of people logging on to vote. I'm going to go with like a 7.7.
Okay. Well, you're not a million miles away. Kitsunegari scores a bang-on 8.0.
Oh, nice.
Out of 10. So that puts it in the... It's not quite in the...
But that's spoiling next week's episode. How does it line up with the previous couple of episodes, like Emily and Christmas Carol and stuff like that?
It's pretty much on a par and then slightly ahead for them.
Okay.
So... and it absolutely trounces next week, which is Schizogyny, which is, I think it's the lowest rated. Here's a spoiler. I think it might be the lowest rated of the season. But yeah, I mean, it's. I would say that puts it.
If you go down to the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. Apparently.
If only that had been the title. Well, it would have been worthy for that alone. But yeah, it's firmly sort of square in the middle, I'd say. Middle to, you know, slightly under. And I think that's fair, really, in terms of if you grade... You know, Season 5 is a really strong season of the show. So in terms of where you would place Kitsunegari, I think somewhere along the 11th, 12th best episode of the season is probably fair dues, I would say, out of 20.
Yeah, I can respect that, I think.
So yeah, now we've got that out of the way. Now we can get to the main stuff, Darren. Now we can get to the big, you know, the meat of it. So let's talk more in depth about Kitsunegari. Kitsunegari, of course, means fox hunt, which we find out when Nathan Bowman is killed. Apparently, it's a Japanese term, but they had to get 2 Japanese translators in to produce the proper Japanese translation of the phrase and the kanji glyph on the wall, because the term fox hunting does not sort of pre-exist in the Japanese language. There is sort of no word for fox hunting, which, you know, it makes sense, because the Japanese aren't horrible like we are.
That's fair. Yeah, that's...
and hunt things down for sport.
They have like is it Kurosawa's Dreams has a sequence about the wedding of foxes, which feels like it could have been a different pitch for this episode if they just used that Japanese title.
The wedding, that would be quite cool, actually. Yeah, in whatever it is in Japanese. But yeah, so obviously it starts with Modell getting out of out of prison, and I think I like this. I mean, I think it's quite atmospheric. Like I say, I think Mark. I can't say enough good things about Mark Snow's music. There's something about the way he scores this which is brilliant. He captures that real sort of operatic, theatrical sense of menace in this episode for me. You know, it's like, and maybe this is again the self-awareness, Darren, because it's like he's aware that, you know, Blofeld is breaking out, and this is big, okay? and he scores it as such.
And what's interesting is that you have this recurring motif throughout the episode, this sort of juxtaposition of, like, because, like, while this operatic music is playing, and to be clear, I'm not saying Mark Snow is at fault here. Mark Snow is entirely on the level. He knows exactly what he's doing. While this big operatic music is playing, you have this shot of, like, Robert Patrick Modell, who can barely push a giant wheel in front of him. And you have this sort of contrast. Oh, by the way, it's worth noting, the young orderly is played by Ty Olsson, who is an actor. He's popped up in stuff like Supernatural, for example. But I will always remember him as the asshole orderly in X-Men 2, X-Men United. He's the man with
yes,
too much iron in the blood.
He is. Yeah. I didn't realise that. It's great. Yeah,
I love that. I love that. Like, he, sort of like his big niche, his go-to niche at the turn of the millennium was like asshole orderly to supervillains. It's like, okay, we got this role. There's a supervillain in custody. We need somebody who's going to be an asshole to him. Is Ty Olsson available? Okay, let's sign him on, because he's very good at it. He's very, very good at it.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
But one of the things that works really well is that you have this juxtaposition throughout of this idea of the episode building up Modell through, like, stuff like the music, the operatic music. But even if we just cut ahead just a scene to the bit, like, after the credits where they're having this big speech and they're sort of, like, giving this speech to the FBI agents about how dangerous he is. You have, like, the orderly, the older orderly is like, if you want to last a day around here, you'll learn never to let your guard down around this guy. But you even have, like, the special agents in charge briefing that they give after the jailbreak, where, like, one of the agents is like, what exactly is adequate backup? Mulder responds, adequate backup? Dramatic pause. Hold stare intensely. Every cop you can lay your hands on. As well,
yeah.
And there's this real sense of, like, building Modell, and he obviously is a threat. Like, let's not downplay it. He does break out of prison, and he does manage to evade capture for a lot of the episode. But there's this real contrast within the episode between how the characters speak about Modell and how he's, like, how the episode frames him, and how pathetic and how vulnerable he actually looks. And I mean, this is obvious even in the performance as well, because it's a really good performance, I think, from Robert Wisden as well, where he's very tired, he's very vulnerable, he's very worn down, and there's a real sense of fatigue about him. And there's a sense that he's not some, like, all-encompassing mastermind with a grand scheme to take over the world or to engage in a game of chess against Mulder. He really doesn't want to be doing this, but the story has been constructed around him, so I guess he's going to end up doing it. And I like that aspect of the episode.
No, it's really good, but I think that was one of the things that frustrated people, particularly at the time, about this, because I think they wanted Pusher 2. You know, I think people really did want to see him come back, if he was going to come back, and be, you know, the same kind of character in a similar kind of episode, because he was such a good bad guy. He was such a great foil for Mulder, that to have him come back and A, be really weak and frail and a shadow of his former self, and B, not even be the actual villain, essentially, for a lot of people were like, well, that's rubbish. That's like doing a sequel, you know, to the greatest movie ever, and not using your main character, or like barely using the villain. And I suppose there are precedents for this, though, in that you would get a sequel that does something entirely different, and everyone hates it because it's not the same film that they loved.
It'd be like making a sequel to Friday the 13th, where, like, they didn't bring back Pamela Voorhees, but instead, like, brought back her son. How crazy would that be? But yeah, no, I completely understand. I see where that's coming from. And actually, like, I understand that, and I get that frustration, because, again, Wisden's Modell is a fantastic character. And the entire point of doing a sequel, like, is to bring back that character. Because he's not like, say, Toombs, where a lot of his power is sort of visual, a lot of his sort of impacts where he can stretch and he can get in there. Now, obviously, Pusher has the ability to get into your head, and that's very effective and it's very haunting, but it's not a very cinematic or visual thing. The large part of the appeal of bringing back Modell, as opposed to bringing back, I don't know, the dude from Revelations, is that, like, Modell is actually, like, a personality. Modell has this presence, and large part that's down to wisdom. Yeah. And so, like, bringing him back, you would think, well, they're going to want to foreground that, because that's the huge appeal, and particularly his interactions with Mulder. But at the same time, while I understand that, I kind of love that, like, large part of what, and we talked about this on Pusher, but a large part of what I loved about Pusher is that it is Modell constructing this narrative around himself. So he's trying to create this myth, and then Scully even describes him here. He sees himself as a Ronin, but he's trying to present this narrative of who he is and this sort of epic struggle which he's engaged in with a worthy adversary, and trying to, like, construct this story. And trying to get Mulder to play along, and trying to get other people to play along as well, and ensnare them in his own narrative events. What I really like about Kitsunegari, and what I think works really well, and again, probably giving the story too much credit here, but is the idea that Modell himself ends up trapped in a story that somebody else is telling. And I really like that. I think that works very well as a sort of like a metaphor for what this story is. Because it's a story that didn't originally feature Modell. Modell wasn't meant to be part of this. He's literally been abducted and inserted into another story. And I like that they sort of like, it's almost metatextual, where the character is like, I really don't want to be doing this. Like, he literally tells Mulder, don't play this game. Like, and I really like that aspect of the episode. I think it's clever. I don't know if it works entirely, and I see its flaws. It's certainly not a highlight of the season for me, but I think it gives the story a little bit of an edge. And a large part of that, as you point out, is the juxtaposition between the Mark Snow operatic score and the sight of Modell, who's like, I just want to do my physio.
It's one of those things where, with a sequel in general, I think different people want different things. I mean, this was the whole debate, wasn't it, about Star Wars recently with The Last Jedi, and how Rian Johnson really did something very different and went in a different path to J.J. Abrams with The Force Awakens. And lots of fans couldn't deal with the fact that he didn't give them, Force Awakens 2, and it's that whole thing. I'm not saying this is anywhere near the same level of, antipathy with that, because those people are mainly mental. But let's be clear about The Last Jedi haters. But the point is ultimately that some people expect a sequel to sort of repeat the beats that were there before, or if not repeat them directly, then give you all the greatest hits of why you loved that first film. And with this, Kitsunegari doesn't really do that. Kitsunegari gives you a little taste of that. The start of the episode, when you've got, like I say, when you've got Mulder out there, does the big speech, you go, Modell is so dangerous, this kind of thing. And then he's calling him up, and it feels like the chase is going to begin again, and this kind of thing. And Scully's concerned because she knows what, Modell's power can be. But then it takes a turn, and I like the subversion. I like the fact that it's not just Pusher 2, because you could never do that in the same way. Pusher 2 would not have been as good as, even if they'd done that story, it would not have had the same resonance, because you've already done it, and it was done greatly.
Well, this is the issue with, like, the live action remakes of Disney films, where my response to them is, like, I'm fine with them existing. It's great that there'll be another generation's version of these stories, and they'll mean a lot to another generation of kids, and they'll make a shed load of money, so Disney shareholders will be very happy. But for me, there's a large question of, why don't I just go back and watch the original animated films? Why would I watch Pusher 2 when I can just watch the first Pusher and it'll be great?
Exactly, and that's exactly why I think with a lot of the sequels in the X-Files, they don't just try and make Pusher 2 Irresistible 2. When they bring back a character, for better or worse, they try and do something different with it. I think the reason they didn't really do that with Tombs is, like you said, they didn't quite feel that they got Squeeze right. Although, like I say, we both really love Squeeze, and that is a great episode, and I prefer that to Tombs actually. But Tombs was much more of a traditional sort of story along that vein, because they wanted to get that story right. So I think Kitsunegari deserves that love for the fact it does go a different way, and then it's just the manner of how that works is maybe where it goes a little bit wrong, because I don't think they quite make the whole Linda Bowman character or that storyline work in the way they maybe thought that it would on the page or in the draft, in the ideas phase.
It is worth noting, actually, just when we're talking about sequels, that this was 1998, so you had a little bit of a sea change happening in culture as well around the same time. So you had things, for example, like the Star Wars prequels were going to be coming out the next year, and it was already known that they were coming, and they were going to be resurrecting the Star Wars franchise. You had things like Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot remakes of Psycho, was coming later in the year as well, as some sort of like avant-garde experiment, where it's like, you like Alfred Hitchcock, right? Well, you know what you'll love? An Alfred Hitchcock movie recreated shot for shot in colour with an additional scene of Vince Vaughn masturbating. How can the kids not adore this? What was the original Psycho missing? Colour and Vince Vaughn masturbating. Again, you have the wonderful quote from like Martin Landau, who'd done the X-Files sort of Fight the Future, who was like, his response when told that like they're remaking Psycho was, how is anyone going to make a Hitchcock movie better than Hitchcock? And I think there's another great quote I have from John Carpenter when he was sort of like, he was asked about why he didn't come back to do more Halloween movies. And his response was, after having directed the first film, was, I didn't think there was any more story, and I didn't want to do it again. I didn't want to do the same story again. And that's the sort of sense of fatigue you have setting in. And I wonder if, and again, this is maybe reading too much into it, the fifth season of The X-Files has this recurring motif and preoccupation about, like, monstrous children. It has this idea of, like, little kids who are going to brutally, brutally murder us. Whether it's by trees, like next week, or with killer dolls, for example, or even, like, by ordering a missile strike, like, for example, the computer does in first-person shooter later in the season. But, like, even things like, say, the postmodern Prometheus as well is also about this monstrous reproduction. We've just come out of a two-parter in which Scully has, like, had a daughter who isn't really her daughter, and who is also, like, in fact, it collapses and is incapable of continuing to live because she's, her genetics are so horribly messed up as a result of the experiments that were done on her. And you have this kind of theme that's running through the entire season of, like, monstrous copies and clones, younger generations, children, that sort of stuff. Even Gibson prays at the end of the season as well as an archetypal sort of monstrous child. And I wonder if, like, you could read Kitsunegari as, like, a meta-textual example of this, in that it is the monstrous offspring of the original Pusher. I jokingly referred to it as kind of like sister of Pusher instead of like Bride of Frankenstein or Son of Frankenstein or whatever. But that's kind of what it feels like. It's almost like, Scully had her, saw her daughter. There's going to be teens who are murdering their parents next week. This is like, what if Pusher had a child and that child didn't turn out right? And again, I wonder if you can tie that into like larger themes of the fifth season with the show's anxiety about the upcoming release of the feature film and Carter's acknowledgement that what he'd originally wanted to end after 5 years, because that's a nice round number that'll get you syndication, was going to have to continue on for 2 more years out of a deal with Fox. Because he's talked about how like he wanted the show to end after 5 seasons, and he was told that he could leave after 5, but if Fox would continue the show running without him. And he faced that choice. There's an AV Club interview, it's very, very good on this. And I wonder if that's an element at play here as well, where there's a sense of like the writing staff being like, we're 5 years into this thing, we kind of expected it to be winding down now and for us to be moving on, because the average length of a TV show is 100 episodes for syndication purposes. But instead, we're going to launch a movie in the summer, and we're probably going to end up moving to Los Angeles, and we'll be doing this for another 2 years. And I wonder if there's an element of that at play in Kitsunegari, where it's like, is this what the future of the X-Files looks like, maybe? Are we going to end up bringing back old elements and doing sequels to old episodes and having to repeat familiar beats and getting trapped telling stories that we don't want to tell because we're expected to? And I kind of like that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, if only that had been the case, we might have got the much hoped for sequel to Fearful Symmetry with the the animal abduction aliens.
This time they're invisibler.
Yeah, well, that's a great theory, really, in that the grand unifying themes there, particularly about the idea of the show eating its own tail, and I think that's one of the things about this story, in that you're trying to retrofit Pusher into it, you're trying to do something a bit different. But the character of Linda Bowman, she's one of those creations, isn't she, that just comes out of nowhere in terms of the backstory of the character. You know?
The closing scene, which does all of the heavy lifting. All of the
yeah.
It's not even hinted at. It's not even, like, seeded. And it's just dropped in casually into conversation. It's one of the most inelegant sort of exposition dumps we've had. And I mean, you know, we've had El Mundo Giro, right?
Exactly. And just to lob in at the end, oh yeah, he had a twin. And yeah, she can do this too, you know. And that's the problem with that is that it takes away from Pusher, doesn't it? In the sense that, you know, part of the whole lore behind, you know, and as you talked about, the very comic book sort of supervillain identity that Robert Modell crafts with Pusher, you know, in that he takes this, you know, this gift that he has, and he ends up, you know, walking the line, a very ordinary man becoming a supervillain, which is exactly what happens later on, as you said, in Pusher with Breaking Bad and Walter White, you know, and he takes this gift and he becomes the Pusher character. You know, in comic books, it would be Pusher would be his supervillain name, and then his real name is Robert Modell. So all these things. But part of the lore of that was that, you know, he'd sort of studied with all this, and it felt like, you know, he'd studied the idea of the Ronin, and he had made all these claims about training with ninjas and everything like that. And it felt like he was quite a solitary individual with this power, you know, and that it was his. So then if you throw in a twin, and yes, okay, I understand the idea of, you know, that if this was a genetic thing, then fine, okay, it could exist in somebody else. But it's such a crowbarring way of allowing for another bad guy. You know, it's in fact, it is like bad comic book writing, isn't it? It is like the kind of thing that you would see in a really dodgy comic book that's like, oh, suddenly that character exists. Oh, suddenly they can do that. And it's why, like you said, if it had been seeded in, you know, even if it was in Pusher, even if there was something in Pusher that said, you know, he was one of two or something like that, I don't know. But if you had a more elegant way to do it, maybe Linda Bowman as a character would have worked. Or alternatively, you don't make her a mystery to be solved. That you right at the very beginning, you see that she's the bad guy, and you know what Pusher's trying to do. Do you know? It wasn't worked well properly in terms of the writing.
Or even like more than 30 seconds before the closing credits start. Like, I mean,
well, yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah.
It's like after the mystery's been, after the like drama's been resolved, after the episode is sort of wound down, after everything's been tidied away, it's like, oh, by the way, Robert Patrick Modell had a secret twin, but it doesn't matter because they're both dead now. That's it. See you next week for Killer Trees.
And it also suffers from the problem of, you know, when they're hunting Modell and he's trying to sort of lure Mulder to say, you know, I've got something I need you to hear. It's one of those classic things that script writing that isn't quite working does, in that there is a perfect opportunity for Modell to explain exactly what's going on to Mulder, and he doesn't do it. You know, when he's got him at gunpoint, he can just say,
send a postcard.
Yeah, right? Yeah. By the way, yeah, I've got a twin sister. Didn't tell you that before. Yeah. Her name's Linda Bowman. She's killed her husband, and she's, you know, I'm trying to stop her. Instead, he says, "Don't play her game," or "Don't play the game." It's like, and part of me tries to rationalise that, Darren, with the idea that he's still playing a bit of a twisted game. That's still that side of Pusher that, on some level, is enjoying Mulder, you know, trying to find this out. But on the other level, I'm like, no. That's purely for plot reasons.
It is,
you know?
Indeed. It's like you're not helping, Modell. Yeah. Not helping.
Yeah. The whole purpose you've escaped is to try and help stop her. So why don't you just tell him? You know, you know he's good because he beat you.
You don't even have to escape. You could just like ask for a phone call. Like,
oh yeah, exactly.
Write a letter like a normal person.
Yeah, and that's it. So it's wonky in that respect. I suppose that one of the things that this does is, and this also is something I'm not sure about, it works very hard to try and make Mulder... It works very hard to try and isolate Mulder, doesn't it? In terms of his thought process. In that, you know, he's the one who knows that Linda Bowman's dodgy, thanks to her
super villain monologue.
Yeah. He doesn't want to paint him as being impulsive. Who the hell talks like that?
It was exactly True right? Blue.
It was True Blue.
To be honest, what I kind of like about Linda Bowman, while acknowledging that last minute twist is far too last minute to even excuse as a parody of hackneyed writing. It's just hackneyed writing. This is Poe's Law, where like anything done sufficiently convincingly. Any parody is indistinguishable from the reality of it as well. But yeah, I think that's just bad writing as opposed to a parody of bad writing. But I like that Linda Bowman is basically like an ascended fangirl to a certain extent, ascended fanboy, where she's decided that she really wants this Pusher sequel to happen. And she's just living her best life at the moment. And she's like, I'm going to try and make this happen no matter what. We're going to have Mulder, we're going to have Modell, we're going to have them hunting each other. It's going to be great. It'll be like Pusher 2.0. And I kind of admire the fact that she's the one who's like, after what they've done, do you think I'd let them get away with this? I'm going to finish what you started. And Modell is like, really, please don't. I'm okay. It's fine.
Yeah, I'm all right.
I made my peace with it. But that sort of like makes sense in terms of things like the ridiculous. Mulder's quite right. It is ridiculous supervillain monologuing, and the issue is that Scully doesn't pick up on it. Like the issue is not that Linda Bowman's doing this, because Linda Bowman is living her best life to a certain extent, where it's like, fine, I'm gonna go out, I'm gonna do what my brother did, I'm gonna make a sequel to Pusher, I'm gonna step into the role of director, I'm gonna be the Bowman of this particular Pusher production. The issue is more that Scully completely misses it. That's the bit that really strains. It's not that she talks like that, and it's not that Mulder catches it, because you can tell Mulder's like, yeah, I know, I was in Pusher, I know how this works.
I know what you're doing.
Yeah, I get this.
If it was a comic book, you literally on the next panel, once they've left, you would have Linda Bowman going, "Ha! They will never know what I'm trying to do," and she'd be there going, "My evil plan is working. My plan to actually, all that kind of stuff." But
there'll be no one to stop me this time.
Yeah, exactly. But that's interesting, because then who comes out looking the most foolish in terms of scripts? Because on the one hand, you might think it's Mulder, because he's being sort of isolated in this sense, but yeah, maybe it is characters like Scully and Skinner who frankly should trust what he says. It's another one of those things by this point that A, Mulder's always right, and B, right, Mulder's always right. just listen to him. He's probably seen something you haven't, and yet again they're like, no, it's like, but she's literally saying things that are like, she might, if she had a mustache, it'd be twirling at this point, Yeah.
Can we play the tape back there? Just rewind a little bit.
Yeah.
It's practically the Sharon Stone interrogation scene from like Basic Instinct in terms of I did it. Yeah. You know that I did it.
Well, he says, doesn't he? Yeah. Mulder says she's waving under our nose. She's playing with us, and she is, and that's the thing. It's like, well, again, for plot purposes, to string out the drama and the tension, you have very, very intelligent characters who are not seeing something for the purposes of story, and that is a problem, big time, with the character of Linda.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I probably cut it a bit more slack, and again, I say I cut it a bit more slack. It's like 6.5 or 7 out of 10, so it's not as if I'm giving it a free pass or a ticket to ride on this, but it's like, give it a little bit of leeway, because like I can see what it's going for, which is that Mulder is the only character who realizes the story he's in. Like, as far as Skinner and sort of Scully are concerned, they're making a straight up sequel to Pusher. Mulder's the one who's like, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. And I like that aspect of like the episode very consciously playing with this idea of making a sequel to Pusher. So you have things like him eating a Carbo bar, which is from the makers of Carbo Boost, to pick one example. See what they did there? Or the cerulean blue paint, which is, by the way, did you notice the paint brand? Did you notice the paint brand of the cerulean blue? It's Gulf Breeze. It turns out it wasn't quite a gentle breeze. But even things like the kind of the ridiculously on the nose thing of having Modell's sister visit him as part of, and I quote, the Little Sisters of Charity.
The Little Sisters of Charity. Who at one point calls him, and the therapist hears her call him a conquered warrior as well, which again is a...
I'm not sure they teach you that. Yeah, I'm not sure they teach you that in like nun school. It's like whenever you're comforting somebody, make sure to call them a conquered warrior.
A conquered warrior, yeah.
But even things like, for example, you get some of the stuff works reasonably well. Like I quite like the affectionate Mel Cooley reference when Skinner breaks in. And the nurse badge that she's wearing, And I think when we talked about Pusher, like, the badge was, like, the one part of Pusher that I can't wrap my head around, which is, like, his powers are voice-based, and his ability to suggest using voice. So how the hell does writing, like, agent or nurse on a piece of paper make any sense whatsoever? So I kind of admire that, like, this doubled down on that and was like, yeah, just stick nurse on it and it'll work fine. But I quite liked, I actually have to admit, for all my cynicism and skepticism about this, I like the repetition. Oh, you also have, like, the attempt to trace a call as well, where they're trying to trace a call and he's trying to get him to stick on the line. And you have that sort of, like, which repeats a scene from Pusher as well. That's, as you point out, that's in the first 10 minutes. That's when the episode is kind of getting you to think this is Pusher 2 as well. But I do like the sequence where Linda talks him into dying, as a sort of a repetition of, is it Burst? From the episode Pusher, the agent who he talks into having his heart, like, literally explode. In one of the most, like, visceral and uncomfortable scenes the X-Files ever produced. I think I talked on the episode about, like, watching Pusher with somebody who could not watch that scene because it was so intense. And I like the idea of what they do here, which is they replay that scene with Modell and Linda, but they replay it sort of gently and soft, and it becomes this weird affectionate repetition thing where it is an echo of what the first episode did, but in a different context, and so becomes a different thing. And it feels like that sequence, which is oddly touching in a very strange, uncomfortable, and grotesque sort of way.
It's like a twisted, like, euthanasia, almost, that she's doing to him. You know? It's that whole, just slow, you'll be fine. And he's like, no, stop. It's like, it's really, it's quite creepy, actually. The way that's done, with the music and everything. It's quite well put together.
And it is, and it's a nice contrast to Pusher, and it works because you have, like, a difference between the two scenes that I'm not sure the rest of the episode, that I think the rest of the episode is going for, but I'm not sure it accomplishes, which is, like, we're doing stuff from Pusher again, yay! But we're doing it in a slightly different way, and it's like, a lot of the episode feels like they haven't figured out what different way works, but that sequence for me is one of the replay a sequence from Pusher with a different emphasis, and it kind of works. I kind of like that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I'm saying all these criticisms. I really enjoy this. I've watched this a lot more than a lot of other X-Files. I have. I always enjoy this episode when I throw it on, because even though I can see that the constituent elements don't quite work and they don't all click together, and there are problems with the story and the plotting, I think it's great fun, and I think it's entertaining, and I think it's mood. It's got a nice sense of mood. It's got a good sense of pace in its own way, and I like the performances. I think Diana Scarwood, who plays Linda Bowman, is good. She's doing what she can with that role. I think she's got that combination of, slight bit of seduction to her. At the same time, the grieving sort of widow. She is in that sense an interesting sort of comic book villain, because she's very good at playing a character. She's very good at playing a role. She's being whoever she needs to be at that specific point, whoever she's talking to. And I think that's quite nice, But it doesn't quite come together. And then by the time you get to the end, after Skinner's shot Modell and she's killed him, and then Mulder realizes it, finds out where she is. You get what is. I mean, what do you make of this denouement, really? Because it feels like a really sort of manufactured way to, put Mulder and Scully in peril. But I think, I mean, when you put it up against the Russian roulette sequence in Pusher, it's not even in the same league, is it?
Not at all.
Because it's playing on Mulder's, fear that maybe he's killed Scully and he's done something terrible. But at the
same time, Gillian Anderson will be starring in the X-Files by the future, releasing in cinemas in 1998. Yeah.
Are we ever supposed to buy, really, that it's Linda and it's not Scully? I mean, that's the problem with it.
I'm waiting for the rest of the show. It's been revealed that it was actually Linda all along. Mulder did shoot Scully at the end of Kitsunegari, but Linda's just been pretending to be her for, like, the remaining 21 years at this point.
Yeah, she's a Skrull.
Yeah,
but nobody.
It's just been. She was going to tell him at one point, but it just became awkward. A couple of years in after he got abducted, and it just sort of began living the lie. Oh my God! I think we've cracked Kitsunegari.
There we go. But I mean, do you think it works as as a climactic beat, Darren, really, this scene?
Not really. And again, this is the thing where it doesn't work except as you pointed out, a pale imitation of the Russian roulette scene. Because again, this is to get you back at the moment where Mulder and Scully are Mulder's pointing a gun at Scully, again. And again, the idea is that you have this little reversal within the dynamic of the scene. So obviously in Pusher, it's more direct, where Modell is kind of forcing him to point the gun at Scully and pull the trigger. Whereas here you have Linda Bowman, who's doing something more subversive and more sort of like kind of subtle, where she's getting Mulder to see Scully as herself in the hope that Mulder will shoot her. And so you have this sort of like perversion going on as well. So it's like Pusher, but it's not exactly like Pusher. So it's close enough, so it feels familiar, but it doesn't feel like it's entirely a rip-off. And you can see what they're going for conceptually with the sequence, but I don't think it works, in large part because you know that the solution to this, like, first of all, you're quite right, you know that Scully isn't dead because Gillian Anderson's going to be back next week. But even beyond that, like, in the moment, in where they are at the moment, all Mulder has to do is just keep the gun on the person he suspects of being Linda Bowman for about 10 to 15 minutes, and it'll probably wrap itself up nicely. Like, the actual tension within the scene is minimal. And again, I'm not normally that guy. I think that you can sort of disguise that stuff if your direction is strong enough or if your writing is propulsive enough. I don't think it is here. So I think that becomes an issue. This is fridge logic, I think they call it, which is the kind of what you have when you think about something between the walk from the couch to the fridge. And it's like there's a lot of that going on in that climax. And I think that it doesn't work for me in large part because of that.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. What I do like, though, is the final beat after, we've got all the exposition about Linda, and Modell. The final beat of Mulder and Skinner's interaction, where, he says, you won her game, and he says, well, why does it feel like I lost? I kind of like that. And I often wonder what it is about that exchange that I enjoy so much. And the idea that Mulder doesn't really feel like he came out of this well. I mean, what do you take from that? I mean, I kind of think it's Mulder's feeling that he didn't feel like, he felt like he was duped. He felt like he was tricked. And maybe he didn't really, maybe he came out of this thinking, well, actually, maybe Modell wasn't a completely evil son of a bitch like I thought he was, and that he doesn't really understand that. I mean, what's your take?
I think, and again, I kind of like that exchange as well, even though, again, I think it's a little overwrought and it comes far too late in the episode, and it's, it's not entirely earned in terms of momentum, like a lot of things going on in this episode, where it's a lot of things that are just thrown out there. And I think that I'm not sure whether that exchange benefits from the fact that we've just had by the way, Modell had an eviler twin, reveal that we had sort of earlier in conversation, where this seems relatively grounded by comparison. So I can kind of latch onto this and I can go with this. But I think that why it works for me, at least a little bit, is down to the fact that it feels like it's paying off a bit from Pusher, actually, in a meaningful sense. Because we talked about one of the things about Pusher, one of the interesting dynamics within Pusher was the sense that Mulder... And I don't want to mischaracterize Mulder. I don't want to seem like I'm being overly harsh, and I don't want to seem like, I'm going like Mulder is a sociopath or anything like that. But a sense that Mulder on some level kind of primally responded to what Modell was doing. And even here you have the line where they're introduced for the first time. It's like, oh, when did you become Clint Eastwood? Where you have this idea of like performative masculinity. And it's not just Modell who's doing this sort of performative kind of masculinity, who's like embodying this Ronin archetype. There's a sense in Pusher that like Mulder himself is kind of a little bit excited at being able to match his wits with somebody like Modell. Your shoelaces untied, made you look, how do you do it? Intense stare sort of thing. And I kind of like that it feels like the end of Kitsunegari is... And again, it's not necessary at all. Pusher gets there entirely by itself, with like Mulder going into the hospital and nearly killing Scully and ending up staring at Modell, and Scully showing up and being like, he's not worth your time, don't think about it, move on. But I think that I like the exchange at the end of this episode because it reinforces the idea of like Mulder, who has been through the experience of Pusher, who has been lured into the romantic fantasy of being Sherlock Holmes hunting Moriarty and his arch nemesis, and who knows from that experience that it's not a fulfilling or meaningful thing, and that it's dangerous, and that it might actually hurt the people he cares about. And so when he goes through that experience a second time, I like that there's a sense of him being much more jaded about it, and like having actually kind of grown and maybe changed a little bit as a character, because he is like watching Kitsunegari. It's very clear that Mulder really isn't into it in the way that he was in Pusher, like running to the phone, answering the phone. Like, I mean, even the sarcastic bit where they find the ideogram written all over the wall in blue paint, and he's like, I think this is a message. It's like Mulder just wants this to be done, and I like that at the end of Kitsunegari you have Mulder reflecting on this. It's like, well, even by playing the game, even by winning the game, I've lost because I participated in this thing that is, doesn't help anybody in any real sense, and has actually just led to much more death and destruction and pain and suffering as a result of it. So I kind of like that as a plot and character beat for Mulder. I think it works relatively well. And again, this ties back into all the other stuff that's going on with Mulder, where Mulder sees himself as the hero of the mythology and the conspiracy and stuff like that. And again, it's worth noting, and I don't think this is literal and intentional. And I think that one of the big issues with the fifth season as a whole is that it struggles to integrate this idea of Mulder's disillusionment into the standalone episodes. It never quite manages to blend like what's set up in Redux 1 and Redux 2 with like any of the individual episodes, with the possible exception of like a throwaway line in Postmodern Prometheus. That I like the idea, or maybe even you could argue in like, what's the episode? The Pine Bluff Variant later in the season as well.
Yeah.
But even here, I like that you have this little hint of like disillusionment where Mulder no longer even wants to be the hero of his narrative. And I think that it sort of works in this context, maybe. But again, this is the maybe I'm reading too much into it, but sort of kicking in.
I don't know if it's that. I think it's more that it could be giving what's in there a little bit too much credit than it deserves in a way, and actually finding things in there that could have been better expressed. And I think what you've said is great, and I really agree with a lot of that. And I think it doesn't quite work.
It certainly doesn't.
Like you said, it's not,
absolutely.
No, it's not quite paid off properly, as you say. That final, if that had been a real thread throughout the episode, and you'd had maybe an earlier conversation between Mulder and Skinner that built up to that, it would have been a much more of a sort of dramatic, sad payoff to the whole thing. And it does leave me with a little bit of sadness in its own way. It sort of takes the wind out of it all. That like you said, the whole thing about Pusher was that it was quite a propulsive, dramatic adventure, whereas this isn't. This is much more of a sort of quite elegiac,
contractual obligation episode.
Yeah, it is, and it's in that sense the flow of it is different and it's strange, and it ends on quite this mournful note. In that, you could read it as well as the idea that you're sad because the sequel was never as good as you hoped.
Mulder sitting at home waiting for Pusher to wake up. He's like, finally.
Yeah.
And to be absolutely clear, I'm not sitting there with a pipe in my mouth saying, and that is why Kitsunegari is a masterpiece of the X-Files. Absolutely not. Just so we're clear. In case my position were misconstrued as that, it's a secret masterpiece. Yeah. It is not a secret masterpiece.
No, it's not.
No, not at all. Not. But I have a huge soft spot for it, though. I absolutely
Same.
do.
I mean, I think it's underrated. I don't think it... it absolutely isn't a hidden masterpiece or a hidden gem even, but it certainly is a favourite of mine, though, personally, for a lot of these different reasons. I really always enjoy it.
Oh yeah, I won't be skipping it on my rewatch of the fifth season. It's like I'm actually quite excited when I get there, because it's like, it's time for a bad sequel. I love a bad sequel. No, because it has its own sort of thrills to it, and I think that they're I don't think the execution is as strong as it could be. I think we've been quite clear about that, but I think that it's aware enough of what it's doing as a bad sequel that it's you feel like you're not being mean spirited and laughing at it to a certain extent.
No, exactly. It's quite the criticism and the laughter at it is. It's not like we're taking a look at Tesso dos Picos. We're just like, oh my god, this is good natured laughter in that
it's in on the joke.
Comes from a place of it's a bit in on the joke. Yeah.
From the makers of Carbo Boost, from the makers of Pusher, Cerulean Blue is a Gulf breeze.
So, okay, before we wrap up, we've got some mailbag feedback from the listeners and people in the Xcast basement group on Facebook.
Hi, guys.
Hi, guys. They've got their own little thoughts on this. So, Michael Little says that I can't really decide how I feel about Kitsunegari. It's nowhere near as good as Pusher. The twist with the sister is super cheesy, and Modell becomes a toothless character in his own story. I quite like that adjective, toothless there. That's interesting. Having said that, this is the X-Files production machine at the top of its game. I would agree with that. There are a number of memorable sequences and visuals. I do love the scene where Mulder figures out who the real villain is. The whole episode seems to be Gilligan mocking the concept of horror sequels, which is similar to kind of what we said, really. You know, there is that element. Interestingly, he says horror sequels, though, Michael, there. I mean, I don't know if I class this as horror. Would you, Darren? Would you say it's horror as such?
I don't know if this is a horror, but I definitely see what Michael's saying in terms of it riffing specifically on the beats of horror sequels. Like, again, we talked about, like, Bride of Chucky was going to be released in cinemas the following summer, to pick an example. But even things like, or actually, sorry, no, it wasn't going to be released the following summer. It was going to be released in October 1998. It was going to be released a couple of months from now. But even things like, Son of Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, Brides of Dracula, that sort of stuff. Like, I get the way that this story is framed, and even things like I joked earlier about, like, Friday the 13th, where the first killer is Pamela Voorhees, and then you have Jason, who comes back in the sequels, to avenge her or whatever. Despite the fact she's normally avenging him, it's best not to worry about these things. But you have that sort of, like, logic at play, which you don't generally get in, like, action sequels, or at least you didn't at the time. Now, I know that in the years since we've had movies like, oh god, Shaft. The recent Shaft.
I haven't seen that yet. Is it as bad as they've said?
It is somehow worse than they've said. But the idea of doing generational sequels now makes a great deal of sense in terms of, like, action storytelling, in terms of, drama, comedy, and things like that, where you have, like, the children of characters from previous films who now get their own installments and stuff like that. But back at the time in, like, the late 90s, I think I get what Michael's saying in terms of it being like a son of, a bride of, a fraternal twin of, The fraternal twin of Pusher doesn't have quite the same ring to it, I'll admit.
No. Good way of looking at it then. Yeah, maybe he has hit on something there. No, that's interesting. Adam Silva says, while not completely terrible, it's still an ill-advised sequel that diminishes a great villain. Would have been better not to have been done. Which, I think a fair few people would agree with, I suppose. Cathy Glinski, Cathy G. I can forgive any issues with this episode just because I get to gaze at Scully in her gorgeous periwinkle suit. It has covered buttons! Cathy's approaching this from the fashion aspect.
We just spent an hour yammering on about it as a bad sequel. I don't think we're in a position to judge here, Tony.
No, I'm not judging her at all. I'm just thinking, if we missed a trick here, should we have been talking more about this stuff? About how they look? I think maybe we should. Kurt North says, it's an interesting episode with some memorable moments, but ultimately it's not particularly good. I would say serviceable. What I would have preferred is seeing Pusher in a more prominent role. That he was in such a desperate, weakened state, still wanting to be that great man and doing everything in his power to have that one last shot of greatness and infamy would have been nice to see. Using everyone around him as he struggles to survive, his one true desire to make Mulder and Scully suffer would have been better, would have been the wiser choice in my eyes anyway. That's interesting, isn't it? That, maybe, did they just hit on the wrong story with this? I mean, do you think that they could have done, I mean, okay, what off the top of your head, what would you have done? What would you have done? What if you'd have brought Modell back? What would your sequel would have been?
Well, it depends. If I wanted to bring Modell back, probably something like that would work fine. Like have him take over a hospital or something like that, or have him sort of like in a situation where he's incapacitated physically but in control of his situation mentally or psychologically. In terms of like, I'm thinking of the way that you have. With comic book supervillains, you typically have that sort of story. I think that you have it with like Matt Fraction and Dr. Octopus in his Iron Man run, for example, or even like Spider-Man with Dr. Octopus and stuff like that, where you have an incapacitated supervillain who has like one last go round because they've got nothing left to lose. And I think that you could do that with Modell quite well. That said, I don't think the fundamental flaw with the episode is necessarily like that taking the emphasis away from Modell. I think that there was a way to do that works. And I quite like the dynamic of Modell losing agency in his own narrative and like being, again, we joked about the contractually obligated sequel, but Modell being drafted into the contractually obligated sequel, I kind of like, and would be a shame to lose in the episode. I just wish the execution of it were much better.
I can't disagree with that. Marlene Stemme says, it's a bit longer, but she says, I think the episode lacked a real sense of villainy. People were supposing what various characters' motivations were, but it was hypothesised rather than demonstrated malice for the most part. Pusher had real back and forth case discussions between Mulder and Scully and brought them closer as solid partners and friends despite their differing ideas and Modell pushing them into opposition. In Kitsunegari, they are already at odds and rather cranky with or without Linda Bowman's interference. The showdown in the warehouse is somewhat suspenseful from a character standpoint, although why would a client meet a real estate agent in an abandoned building? That's a good point. Actually,
it's the 90s. People were much more trusting. Yeah, I have a Mr. S killer. He's meeting you there, yeah.
But it shows nothing new about Mulder and Scully. There might be a little inkling of Mulder not pulling the trigger that mirrors Pusher, and perhaps a small lesson in Mulder holding off on vengeance when listening to Scully. Too bad Scully didn't get a similar chance to speak at several points in My Struggle 4, but that's beside the point. But I can't see much of a point. I don't think it's a bad episode, but I also don't consider it underrated because of its predecessor episode. It's just okay. Marlene makes some good points there, I think. I mean, the idea that it doesn't really... It is one of those episodes, I suppose, that in a way doesn't really advance Mulder and especially Scully's character. You know, there is this, as we talked about with Mulder, there is some of this idea about his psychology and all that kind of thing, but it doesn't really, there's nothing different about them, is there, by the end of this?
There's nothing essential or revealed even. Like, you don't even have to change a character because of the reality of episodic television in the 90s. You just have to reveal some facet of them, and there's nothing in here that hasn't been revealed elsewhere before and better in terms of, like, character storytelling. I would concede that very readily, yeah.
Andrew Levitt says, while Kitsunegari doesn't hold a candle to Pusher, it's still an enjoyable episode in its own right and better than the episodes that precede and follow it.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Seconded.
Absolutely.
That said, I will go to bat for schizogeny. I won't actually go to bat because I'm not on next week's episode, but I have a bit of a soft spot for emo teens who murder people with trees. I mean, come on. I grew up on Doctor Who from like the 80s and kind of 90s. Yeah. I'm willing to put up with a lot.
We'll see what next week's... I'm not on it either, because I don't think I'm ever watching that one again. It's rubbish. But, we'll see what...
We'll get to the root of the problem.
The writers knew it couldn't live up to Pusher, so rightfully created another villain to take his place, making him the villain. However, this saps the power from Modell, who was really cunning and lovable monster despite what he made others do. The twist of the real villain being his sister is interesting, but she is far less memorable than her brother and comes across as a heartless, cliché villain. Yeah, having the audience and Scully think Mulder has been pushed adds some much-needed drama in the middle of the episode, and the climax is suitably tense. That said, the episode as a whole isn't memorable like the original and comes across as fairly middle of the road. Bringing Modell back, while something I would have loved to see if done well, saddles this episode with too much baggage, specifically living up to Pusher, which it struggles with. I think the idea of Modell being a cunning and lovable monster, I think that's true, isn't it? I mean,
it's the personality. That's the thing.
Yeah, like, it is.
There's a reason you want to bring him back and not like the dude from, I don't know, to pick an example, Teso dos Bichos, one of those, like the possessed mummy from Teso dos Bichos. In large part because Modell is charming, because Robert Wisden's charming. He's got this like engaging presence, and again, he's a very human monster as well in terms of the X-Files. He's not like Fluke Man. He's recognisably, and again, we've talked a lot about how he's a Gilligan kind of protagonist to a certain extent. He's a little man who wishes he was big, which is something that becomes like a staple of Gilligan's work throughout his sort of filmography. And I can see that. Just on that comment there. Were we supposed to believe that Mulder had been pushed in the middle of the episode? Did you really, like, watching it? Again, I wonder when I watched it the first time, because again, I've watched this episode countless times, but I wonder if I ever really doubted or questioned Mulder, if the episode was ever structured in a way that I would. I'm not saying that it didn't mean to, and I'm not saying that it's not another slight problem with the episode that it doesn't get that across. But I'm kind of curious if that's what you think was intended, actually.
I don't know. I don't think so. I think there is that moment, obviously, where he's got Modell at gunpoint, and then he walks out and he goes, he had to go, like, which is the recurring thing, all through the episode. So he's been pushed to some extent there, but it's not the same as the other guys you see being pushed, or in the previous episodes with what happens to some of the characters. I don't feel like that lingers on, which I think might be what Andrew's sort of getting at. I don't feel like he spends the whole sort of episode in this reverie and then suddenly he snaps out of it. No, I No, I just think he sees through it.
He's just a puppet who can see the strings, Tony.
Well, there you go. So yeah, interesting though. It's an interesting way of looking at it, that he might have been pushed a bit more than, you might imagine. So it's cool. Finally then, Chandru Ravindran says, this is an episode I think gets overshadowed by the awesomeness that is Pusher, and still feels a bit like a cheat that is elevated by that very awesomeness. Still, ignoring all of that, this is still a fun little episode with good suspense and set pieces. Love that scene where the Doctor electrocutes herself in front of Mulder. It feels like yeah. It makes it. Oh, I love that. Love a bit of electrocution.
Well, no, because it is. It's a moment that works in the pulpy sense of the episode. Like the episode is pitching for a pulpy register, and that kind of lands squarely. Like if the rest of the episode were like that, I also quite like Modell, like with the clerk and with the baseball bat and with the snake as well.
Yeah,
that sort of thing as well. Those little moments work very well. I mean, we've been rather harsh on it, but there are moments that work quite well within it.
Oh yeah, because they are a bit like Pusher, the episode, and he says it feels like a play on Frank Burst's death. Yeah, there is. That's true. There is. Plus, I love having Robert Patrick Modell back, though I could have done without the amount of effort that went into humanising him. One thing I find odd about the episode is that the soundtrack seems to completely change halfway through the episode, unless I'm misremembering. The first half is a very unique score, while the second half is good but more run-of-the-mill. The second thing that I think of with this episode is that I really wish they made the decision to have Gillian Anderson play both fake Scully and real Scully at the end. Not sure how it would have worked. The impact of seeing Scully dead may have been lost, but I think the dramatic stakes would have been raised seeing Mulder screaming in anguish at actual Scully. Let's address the first thing there, because there's 2 points there that I'm interested in. Well, no, 3 actually. The first one, the idea that they shouldn't have humanised Modell in the way they do. I mean, I don't know. I kind of like that. I kind of like the fact that he's not redeemable in that sense, and I still think he's a little bit twisted, and he still likes playing the game a little bit. But you do get the sense that he's maybe over the last couple of years thought that maybe I shouldn't have done some of that stuff. Yeah. I don't know what you think. I got that impression.
Well, I definitely got the impression that, again, he makes a conscious point not to kill anybody, which is quite... And again, I remember being quite struck by that when I watched it the first time. And I think that's something that could work rather well in a better episode as well, because Mulder makes the point of it as well. Why didn't you have the 2 cops kill each other? But even why didn't you have the orderly kill himself as well? Which is, not exactly how Modell works. And they have that conversation as well with the therapist, who's like, hey, I'm pretty sure he belonged in here, but he was always very civil. And you never really get an explanation for what it is that changed, for aside from, and again, in real life you could write and you could say, it was a massive brain injury, of course he had a personality change, but that's a bit of a cop-out from a dramatic sense, because again, you want continuity of character when you're watching a story, and particularly when you're bringing back a character, you want the character to be relatively consistent with what came before, and it doesn't feel like that change is entirely earned, outside of, again, that metatextual element that I admittedly am very fond of, which is Modell really doesn't want to be in a Pusher episode, so Modell is not going to do all the crap that he has to do in a Pusher episode. He's going to be like, fine, no sexy death scenes for you. Nobody's setting themselves on fire. Nobody's having a heart attack in a dingy apartment block like something from Seven. We're going to get a dude, he's going to be walking down the middle of a road. That's going to be cool. Maybe somebody else is going to be knocking his head really annoying, like a monotone against a wall. And if I can fit it in, I'm going to have 2 cops point guns at each other, but not shoot each other, because that'd take it too far. And I kind of like that aspect of it. However, again, it's kind of interesting, and I'm wary as somebody who criticizes stuff, being like, well, how I would fix this is. But it seems strange that you could... with just a little bit more work and a little bit more finesse, you could construct a nice little arc where Modell had, discovered he had a twin and had discovered that she was using her power. Because it's implied that, Modell doesn't want Linda to suffer in the way that he did, and he doesn't want her to use her powers in the way that he did, because he's realised that that's brought nothing but suffering, not only to him, but the people around him, and he wants to spare her that. But all of that happens off screen, and none of it is even mentioned during exposition. There's never a moment where Modell is to Mulder, you have to save her, or something like that, or stop her from making the same mistakes that I did. Or even when Modell says to Linda, look, you're making a terrible mistake, I've done this. None of that is ever articulated. It's just implied, and it does feel like it robs Modell of, I'm not entirely sure of whether or not he can be redeemed, and I think that, there is a tendency in media to redeem sexy villains, and Modell is a sexy villain, perhaps a little bit too quickly. But I do think that there was an element for, there was an opportunity for like development there that was kind of missed in that regard, I think.
I agree. Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Chandru's second point's interesting about the soundtrack. And that it's more run of the mill by the end. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. I think I always remember the climax having that same sense of operatic theatrical score to it that Mark Snow doesn't always get the chance to do. This episode is different. It sounds different than a lot of the other stuff that can be sometimes. I'm not saying it's bad, 'cause it's not, but more synthetic and. More run of the mill in general. The score here never feels run of the mill. It always feels like he's shooting for something a little bit more
grandiose.
Grand.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah, grandiose. I mean, did you hear any change in the score? Really?
I didn't, but I didn't really keep an ear out for it. I quite like Mark Snow's score here, but I hadn't noticed the register or the shift between the second halves. Now I want to go back and watch it. So if we can pause the podcast recording for about 45 minutes, come back and then I'll kind of answer that question. I actually kind of do want to watch it again.
Come back.
Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I know. Me too, actually. And finally, the point about Gillian Anderson and the fake and real Scully, and seeing whether seeing Scully dead may have been lost. What do you think about that? I mean, his point. I'll read that again. I wish they'd made the decision to have Gillian Anderson play both fake Scully and real Scully at the end. Not sure how it would have worked. The impact of seeing Scully, in inverted commas, dead may have been lost. But I think the dramatic stakes would have been raised seeing Mulder screaming in anguish at actual Scully. Do we not see her then? I mean, I'm a bit confused about this because I can't immediately remember. Do we not see her dead on the floor?
We do see her dead on the floor, yeah.
We do, don't we?
Yeah.
So
it's more that like he's pointing the gun at who he believes to be Linda Bowman, who's played by the actor who's playing Linda Bowman, talking as if she's Scully, because she is Scully, really. And I think that what's being suggested is that you would have both Scully dead and Scully talking to Mulder at the same time, which would be interesting. You'd have to change the scene though slightly so that it would be.
You flip it round.
Yeah. Well, not even flip it round. That's the thing. And again, this is something I find interesting about Kitsunegari and Pusher. And I know we've gone on long enough, and I apologize to listeners. I find it interesting that Kitsunegari is much more subjective in its camera work than Pusher. Now, obviously, Pusher has moments where, like for example, in the teaser to Pusher, where the truck disappears into thin air before the car pulls out and gets hit. But for most of the time with Pusher, you're actually seeing what's really happening, and you're watching his words sort of impact on characters. So, for example, when Modell has a little like piece of paper that says agent on it, you still see Modell with a little piece of paper that says agent on it. You just see everybody act as if he's an FBI agent. When he tells Holly that, Skinner is the man who attacked her, you don't see Skinner change into the man who attacked her. As far as the camera's concerned, that's still Skinner. The episode just counts on Holly seeing the person she attacked without the audience having to see it as well. And one of the things that's interesting about Kitsunegari is how it kind of... I don't want to say it breaks the rules, because that implies that, those rules are necessarily fixed in stone or important, or that they have like intrinsic value of themselves. I think that you can do interesting things when you sort of shimmy or change the rules or adjust the way that you approach things. But it's interesting how Kitsunegari sort of shifts that so that more often than not, you get a glimpse of what the characters are actually seeing as it's described to them. So like when Linda has a little note saying nurse, you actually see the nurse first, and then you realize it's Linda. Where Modell is talking to the guy about, snakes, you actually see the snake with the baseball bat. Now, you get a couple of, like, reverse shots where he's holding the baseball bat just to remind you that it is a baseball bat. But you get these shots that kind of put you in the perspective. When the police officer is, like, tracking Modell down and is pointing a gun at his partner, you're seeing Modell there as well. So you're put in his subjective perspective. And I I like that. I think that's an interesting way of inverting the dynamic in Pusher. I think it maybe isn't as confident as Pusher is, because Pusher counts on the performances of the actors to sell those moments and to generate tension and to raise stakes. Whereas Kitsunegari falls back on the idea of images themselves in a way that feels cheap and kind of a little bit... We talked about this earlier on, where it's like it feels a little bit almost tacky to be like, oh, Scully's dead. No, she's not. Nobody ever believes that Scully's dead. I realize that, like, you're never actually going to convince me that Mulder, that Scully's been shot and she's lying dead on the ground, because I know Gillian Anderson is going to be back next week. So it's a bit of a cheap shot to include that. It's arguably, like, more effective to do it in the way that, say, Pusher would have done instead of Kitsunegari, where Pusher would have been like, you can see Scully lying dead on the ground, and the camera is very clear that she's not there, but you're watching Duchovny react as if she is, and you're watching Duchovny's heart break as if she is. And the camera isn't lying to you, the viewer, in order to try and trick you into having that emotional response. I think that's an interesting sort of push and pull, and I think that kind of gets to the question that was being asked there. Yeah,
that's true. You've articulated that really well, and I think that's an interesting point there from Chandra, actually, in the way it's approached. But great points in general, guys, as always, from the mailbag. Thank you so much if you've replied. If I haven't got to your comment, I apologise. I haven't got to yours, Matt Latham, because you said it's better than the original, obviously. Don't be ridiculous. He is joking. I know he's joking. But, like, don't even try it, Latham, all right? We know it's not true.
Do we? do we really? I feel like you're being very, very, very assertive there, Tony. I feel like you're being very defensive.
I'm allowed to be, because it's Latham. The rules are different. But yeah, thanks as always, guys, for your comments. They're great. And thank you, Darren, for coming back on for Kitsunegari. And we've put Pusher to bed now. That's it. He's gone.
We've done our contractually obligated sequel.
We have. So until you're back on the show again, which you will be for some more season 5, then update us to where people can find you and what you're up to.
Okay, cool. So I am currently, I run my blog, the movie blog, with a 0 instead of an O in movie, where I write up and review about films. We're also going to be in the midst of Oscar season when this is coming out, so a number of high-profile releases will be coming out as well. In that context, I co-host another couple of podcasts. The first one is the Scan On podcast, which will be releasing weekly, which will be covering new releases and film news and stuff like that as it's happening. So if you want to keep track of, at this time of year, we'll be going into stuff like the awards race and sort of like the Guilds Awards and stuff like that, but even the big releases coming to cinemas week in and week out. And I also host another podcast which is a bit more focused about movies, which is the 250. And based on sort of what we expect, we'll have just come out of Christmas. I think we'll have done like The Apartment, the Jack Lemmon film, we'll have covered for Christmas as well.
Oh, great.
It's a fantastic one. It's a very unconventional Christmas film, but it's still very much a Christmas film. But even things like, for example, we'll be covering, at this stage of year, what generally happens is a lot of awards fare comes into and out of the list. I can't tell you what it's going to be for reasons that are completely ambiguous and mysterious, but you have to trust me. But there will likely be films that are coming into and out of the list, so myself and Andrew will be discussing those as they come into and out of. So it'll probably be a little bit more current, a bit more modern, a bit more relevant than our traditional sort of coverage on the show.
Fantastic. I've been on the 250 a fair bit. I imagine many of you listen to it, 'cause it's a great podcast. So make sure you don't miss it, because you're gonna get some fantastic stuff there. So yeah, you can find me as always at AJ Black Writer on Twitter, and all our stuff will be in the credits, where you can find us. But as always, guys, thanks for listening, and remember, until next time, we had to go. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music, and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
It's alive!